All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first GYC lab. The point of the session, I'm sure I missed you guys. I just saw you yesterday, right? I'm sure you remember it yesterday. We had amazing questions and we couldn't really get to all of them. So we wanted, and that kind of always happens in this training. So what we really wanted to do is have an interactive session where you have a lot more opportunity to ask questions to the speakers directly. The problem with that is we are unable to have interpreters when it's interactive sessions. We need kind of to have more prepared curricula for the interpreters to be present with us, so apologies for that. However, we have asked our speakers to kind of keep their interventions brief and clear so they are accessible to everybody. So how we're going to do this is we're going to kind of do a panel style of speakers. We've got 4 amazing speakers today, and they'll each talk for about 10 to 15 minutes on the UNFCCC negotiations and the legalities and whatnot. And then we'll have around 30 to 45 minutes of Q&A, depending on how long the panel takes. That will be divided. We'll let you guys kind of unmute and ask your questions, around like 7 or so questions directly to the speakers. And then there will also be the option to add your questions to the Menti meter, which will be shared later. And there we can have you guys kind of just upvote the questions you like the most, and then Luigi and I will take turns reading them out. And then the last thing I wanted to tell you is that we will have a break after this session until July 2nd, and that is for the SBs at Bonn. Some of our team will be there, and if you'll be there, shoot us a message on Slack or send us an email, and we'd love to see you. And in the meantime, there will be an assignment, just because we want you guys to follow along with what's happening in the SBs. There will be more. I'll send you in the follow-up email a lot more details about the assignment. But essentially, at the end of the week, each week you'll pick 3 negotiation tracks, like the ICPH or the daily report, etc. And then you'll write like a quick recap about it. It doesn't have to be like comprehensive. It doesn't have to have like a word count or anything. It's just kind of so we know you followed the negotiations. Again, I'll clarify it more in my follow-up email. And last thing is the assignment. So the assignment, the attendance form. I sent you yesterday's attendance form today, and I'll send today's tomorrow. And because they were back-to-back sessions, you have until June 19th to respond to both attendance forms. One final thing before I hand off to Luigi to introduce herself is that this session will be recorded, as our sessions typically are. So so if you're going to speak live, note that you will be on the YouTube forever. So yes, that's all. And Luigi, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to see you guys here today. And I'm really, really happy that everyone's here and that we're all coming together for this amazing session. The speakers today are absolutely incredible. So I encourage you guys to ask them as many questions as you want. I'm sorry to the speakers for that in case you get too many of the questions. But basically, today is the first interactive session, like Mirna said. You guys can like just interact. Interactive session, interact, yeah. And yeah, without further ado, yeah, there's also something that we're gonna do if the questions get a bit too hectic, because like we want everyone to raise their hands first before opening their microphones, and then we'll tell you guys to like who can ask first and stuff. So if that gets a bit hectic, we're going to switch to Menti. But yeah, thank you guys. And over to Mirna now to introduce our first speaker.
Yes. So first, our key learning outcomes, you can see them on your screen. And basically they're, yes, to understand the major frameworks, rules, methods, and processes of the UNFCCC, and to know how to draft a text, engage in negotiations, and basic do's and don'ts for the COP spaces. It's basically when hopefully you are at COP30, you know how to move around and how to be as impactful as possible. So now our first speaker is Heidi White. Heidi is an international lawyer and independent consultant based in Tasmania, Australia. Heidi commenced her career working as a legal associate at the Federal Court of Australia, where she managed cases and supported judges to draft judgments and court orders. Amazing. At the same time, Heidi started providing pro bono support, including strategic and technical advice to a wide range of stakeholders in the climate negotiations, including young negotiators from developing countries, which she considers critical drivers of effective change, with the ultimate goal to support developing countries to achieve ambitious outcomes. Heidi is now a global expert on the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement negotiations with a special focus on loss and damage. She has been involved in negotiations that advanced the international work on this issue, including agreements to establish and operationalize the Santiago Network and Loss and Damage Fund. Heidi remains engaged as an advisor for board members of these and other relevant loss and damage processes. Heidi, please go ahead. We're so excited to hear from you.
Hello, hi. I always feel a bit when I'm having a bio read to me like that. So thank you. I'll just get my slides up. I've just we've had one of a little last minute shift in our speakers list. So if you bear with me, I just added an extra slide to my presentation. Okey-doke. Okay, so hello everyone. We can skip past my first slide. Nice to be here with you all, and really exciting to hear about this program and initiative, and the level of interest in this process is really exciting from young people who hopefully, as my bio says, can help drag this process along and bring it to life, and really create impactful outcomes on climate change going forward. So this is the slide I just quickly put together for you all because of our change in speakers. So bear with me with like the heavy text, but basically I just wanted to give you a really quick primer on the convention and its instruments before going into a little bit more detail on how negotiation text is drafted, some of the language that's used in negotiations, some of the do's and don'ts in terms of how to engage in the process from an inside perspective. I've been grateful and privileged and lucky to be able to attend party delegations since I started working in the process. So I'll be coming from more of that inside perspective, and some of our latest speakers will bring more of the observer civil society angle to things. So first, I just wanted to give the really clear context that the convention, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, as it's called in the long form, was established as a living instrument. So this is to constantly evolve. We meet, the parties to the convention meet every year to continue to negotiate decisions to enhance the implementation of the convention, to keep up with the latest science, to keep up with the latest policy developments internationally, changes in positions of governments, ensuring that the convention can be as effective as possible. As you all probably know, we also have some other related legal instruments that were established under the convention. We have the Paris Agreement and we have the Kyoto Protocol. And each of those bodies, the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, and the Kyoto Protocol, each have what we call governing bodies. So you have the COP, which is the Conference of the Parties. That's the governing body of the convention. You have the CMA, which is the governing body of the Paris Agreement, and you have the CMP, which is the governing body for the Kyoto Protocol. And so here you'll just see in the slide, I've put the article from the convention, which speaks to how the COP will keep under regular review the implementation of the convention, et cetera, make decisions necessary to promote effective implementation. So underneath these major governing bodies, you then have 2 permanent, what they call subsidiary bodies, and they're called the SBI and the SUBSTA. The subsidiary body for implementation is the SBI, and the SUBSTA is called the subsidiary body for scientific and technical advice. These are often just referred to as the, that's why we have now the SB 62 meeting happening in the next few weeks, or the SBs as they're called colloquially. And so these subsidiary bodies meet each year, usually twice a year, once in June and once just prior to the COP, CMA and CMP meetings. And parties will basically come together and make draft text, draft agreements, or have meetings to talk about different issues that are being advanced. And you will either have as an outcome of these meetings either the draft decisions or just summaries of the discussions that have been happening. And I've put here as well in the slide that there are other ad hoc bodies that are sometimes established outside of these main areas where negotiations happen. And so I've got, for example, when parties to the convention were preparing for the entry into force of the Paris Agreement, there was a specific extra subsidiary body set up for that did a lot of work. And we, of course, also have boards, committees, work programs, a whole range of other processes under the convention to work towards implementation. And then I've got here, just as another process element, you have for the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, they both agreed to use the same framework as the convention does in terms of the ongoing negotiation of decisions under the subsidiary bodies. So I'll share these slides after and you can go through that in your own time. So that's I guess the technical context in which the negotiations happen. And then when our other speaker comes in later, he'll take you through a little bit more of the dynamics of the different party groupings and the negotiations groupings as well. So first question, how is negotiation text drafted? Again, I'll try and skip through this and leave you to read it in more detail later. I just wanted to give you the context, and you can maybe ask me some questions about different situations where this might change a little bit in practice later. But first, in terms of process, you have first the mandate for negotiations, and these are set by past decisions or conclusions under these different governing bodies that I mentioned. And I guess maybe you've already found in your sessions so far, there's a lot of acronyms, a lot of technical terminology. So don't worry if this is a little bit of word soup as I'm going through the presentation. It all comes through practice and hearing it more times. The second point I wanted to flag is you can look to the agenda for sessions. These define what action is needed, what parties are there to agree to. And then in terms of the next step with decision text is there'll be a range of documents. There might be submissions in advance of a session. There might be a report, a synthesis report of different party views that have, and non-party views that have been provided to the process. And there's also, I guess, an informal type of input in terms of the way that observers operate, and Veena and Haley will go through this later, in terms of advocacy, where views can also come into the negotiations and different positions. So in terms of process, usually the session will start with co-facilitators, one from a developed and one from a developing country, that will be appointed to lead consultations on a negotiations item. And these are called contact groups. The text that parties and countries are negotiating will start either from previous decisions. There might be what's called a conference room paper, which is an informal paper or a non-paper. There's lots of different terminology, but basically you either start with a text already or you're starting from scratch. And the co-facilitators will take parties through that process, and throughout the session you'll move through different iterations of a document based on inputs by parties, and again through other informal processes where observers may bring in their views. And then in terms of the format, either the co-facilitators will compile text or parties will go into what's called an informal type session where they'll work on text together and they'll self-organize and work together. And a good example of this is in Baku, for example, with one of the loss and damage negotiations items, we actually had a bit of a creative, this is arranged in different ways by different groups, and it's very context dependent, and depending on what the negotiators feel like will work most effectively at the time. So for the Warsaw International Mechanism negotiations item in Baku, we did a combination of the co-facilitators produce some elements and decision text to propose back to the negotiators on things that weren't so contentious and felt like they were quite straightforward. And then parties went off separately and organized themselves and sat together and drafted text on more contentious issues. So that's the drafting process. And then in terms of language, I'll get the team to share these slides after. There's so much language in the sessions, and I find this IAD guide to climate negotiations terminology really useful. There are a lot of really usefuls that you can use to guide yourself through the process. In terms of decision text, you have the title of the decision may be negotiated, then there's the preamble of the decision, which sets the context, and then there's the operative paragraphs, what actually what are the obligations that parties set up for themselves and for others. And then there's also work on shall, will, should, invitations. There's lots of different language that's used to have different levels of obligation. And then I've also put here common conventions when drafting text. And I won't go through this now in the interest of time, but there's a lot of different ways that parties use to distinguish between things that they agree to, things that they're testing in terms of different options, and then marking ideas to return to later, or for complex items where there might be footnotes or placeholders. And then in terms of effectively engaging in negotiations, so know your role. As I've already said, there's parties, there's observers. Who are you supporting and what are the positions that you're trying to advance? There's the technical preparation for these types of documents, what documents to read. But I think possibly most importantly, there's the political preparation. For me as a lawyer, coming from working in a domestic sort of standard private law space with the Federal Court in Australia to working in the international space, the law is not so black and white in the international sphere, and often it's the most, it's the most powerful country in the room, which can drive the direction of negotiations. So if you're not prepared to navigate that diplomacy and all of those different relationships, that can be where you fall down. No amount of technical preparation and even precedents that you use can get you ahead in some of these negotiations. For example, again in Baku, there was a negotiation we had on the boards, the loss and damage fund board report, and we were arguing with the US about a particular paragraph that we wanted in the decision text. And even though I had 3 or 4 precedents for this particular issue and this particular language in other different funds in the convention decisions, that wasn't good enough to get us over the line, and we needed more of a political solution to get that particular language in about scaling up finance and enhancing obligations on finance of developed countries. And Luigi, one of our co-facilitators, got to be there for that that very challenging and stressful and disappointing set of little huddle of negotiations on that issue. So political preparation is key. And then during negotiations, I've also just listed here a few things to keep in mind in terms of coordination. Again, one of those things that makes all of the difference, particularly in a really busy and crazy conference situation where people have diverging priorities and they're running around, not able to keep up with the pace. Coordination is really important. There's tracking documents and positions, again, facilitating consensus, bringing ideas, bridging proposals, talking to people. And then there's obviously then there always needs to be somebody who's drafting text, finding precedents, even if they don't always work, and coming up with ideas about language. And then the final point I just wanted to cover is about the art of negotiation. So in terms of negotiations, there's a lot of do's and there's a lot of don'ts. And for me, I've learned all of these along the way through mistakes, testing things. Negotiations is about people, and it's about developing trust, about building alliances, finding countries who will champion certain ideas, and figuring out the landscape, basically. And it's really important to know your positions, keep up with the tone of the conversations and their dynamics. And one of the really important ones in terms of the way that the developing countries group work and the G77 in China is about doing no harm to your allies. So this is a really critical thing in negotiations. When you're finding that you're not powerful enough to get a position across the line, having unity among a big group can really make all of the difference. And then in terms of don'ts, speaking without preparation or a mandate. In negotiations, there's usually lead negotiators for country groupings. Obviously, there's seniority and the usual things like that you really need to keep an eye on in terms of respecting the process and respecting roles. And leaving complex issues to the end is a really big one in negotiations. So at COP26 in Glasgow, we had a push towards the very end of the COP to establish a loss and damage finance facility, as it was then called. And that proposal didn't come until the very, very, very end. And it wasn't, I'm not sure if we ever would have gotten that anyway, no matter how early we started, but it really put the negotiators in a difficult situation, because often the negotiators aren't necessarily the ones, they have a limited mandate from their capitals or from their more senior people in their delegation of what they can and can't agree to. So you always want to leave enough time for that permission or for that work behind the scenes to be done, so that you can get really challenging and really ambitious outcomes. And then the final point is about the getting stuck in one agenda. So I heard at the start, one of your exercises is to follow some negotiations tracks. I think when you're starting out, it's really important to follow just a few things to start with so you don't get overwhelmed. But overall, it's important to, over time, get a sense of the big picture and the full spectrum of issues being dealt with at the negotiations, because they're all interconnected. And so as far as possible, if you can stay across everything, have people in different spaces that you can talk to is the best way to do it. You don't necessarily have to have everything on your mind all at once, but just having people you can speak to in the hallways to say, okay, what's happening with that item? What are the challenges? What's this country pushing here? And seeing if there's anything happening across the board that you might need to come up with a bigger strategy and a bigger picture approach to get the outcomes that are needed. So I'll finish with my key messages, I guess, for the session. So I've got learn by doing. As I said before, everything I know I've learned on the job. I've learned by being present, by asking questions, and by listening. So that's really important. It's only so much you can learn from reading things on a screen or reading things on paper. Drafting text, know the mandate and understand the process. And process is something that is less well understood, I think. because it can be so technical. So if you can be the person in the room that knows the process, you can have a really big advantage. Language, just observe, study, prepare a cheat sheet for yourself. Engagement, prepare both technically and politically, and coordination matters. And in terms of diplomacy of negotiations, be strategic, respectful, and constructive. Thanks, guys. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Heidi. You did incredibly, and I just want to say that like Heidi is the person who literally like she taught me everything that like I understand now about negotiations. So thank you to her for everything and for the presentation. For now, I think
I'll interrupt you for a second, Luigi, and clarify. We'll take the questions at the very end, everybody. So like I said, it's a panel style, and then you can raise your hands and ask your questions. And please either ask them in the live or drop them in the Menti. Don't drop them in the chat. Okay, Luigi, please introduce our next speaker, and thank you.
so. For our next speaker, we have Vina, and I'm going to introduce her now. Vina is a political scientist, entrepreneur, and social worker. She started her career in ethical fashion, focusing on eradicating inhumane practices in garment labor and setting up fair trade and fair labor standards in factories. And in 2022, she co-founded the Youth Negotiators Academy, YNA, which is aimed at enabling youth leadership for readdressing systemic inequalities that exist in multilateral climate negotiations and to enable young people as negotiators for the multilateral processes. She currently serves as the Director of Institutional Relations at YNA, where her work involves positioning YNA as a thought leader in environmental diplomacy and intergenerational leadership. And she specializes in justice, in political participation, institutional governance reform, and ensuring frontline voices are included in multilateral decision-making. She wrote her thesis on leadership in climate negotiations, and she continues her research journey now. Thank you so much for being here, Vina. Over to you.
Thank you, Luigi, for that introduction. And I feel very similar to what Heidi said. It's very interesting when someone else reads your bio and introduces you. It's a very different feeling. So I come into this conversation with that feeling as well. In a moment, I'm also going to share my screen. But most importantly, before I did that, what I wanted to do is also acknowledge everything that Heidi said about the process being very complex. Like from everything that you heard, you know that this is not something we can condense into 10 minutes, but the idea was to set like really good context for you. But I think what we want you to leave with is to recognize the complexity itself. And I think that is the first step, because then you can understand how do you like move away from that complexity and how do you navigate through that. So the space itself has a lot of different actors and a lot of different processes, and we as organizations and civil society and the global movement right now is asking for more plurality in the sense of we want more actors, we want more civil society integration, or we want larger COPs, or we want more formats of discussion, or so there are so many different conversations going to. So perhaps like it's also worth recognizing that the UNFCCC, as we know, might not be the same in the coming years as well. With that, I'm going to quickly share my screen. All right, just give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. Perfect, thank you. All right, so the current state of negotiations and the governance system itself within UNFCCC, if you see, you can probably recognize through different headlines you might see after one of the gatherings, for example, let's say one of the COPs. I many times see, oh, COPs, after COPs, we're not really seeing negotiations yielding in any result. What is happening? What is multilateralism even doing? So there are lots of different mindsets and perceptions about what is happening within the negotiations, and even if the negotiations are successful at all, or if this is the right format. So the first thing that I wanted to come in is to say that a part of it comes from the fact that the outcomes that are coming out of these conversations, negotiations, and these discussions that the actors actors within the space are having, they are not definitely reflecting the urgency or the ambition or the implementable nature of like outcomes that are necessary in this era of the climate regime itself. And what this has then led to is actually like trust that is being degraded. You recognize that people, citizens, are not trusting the decision makers and the policy makers because they believe that nothing's really happening. Countries within or the actors within are also not trusting each other because we are not able to really bring in that perspective of justice. There is this divide between different countries, different groups of countries, developed countries, developing countries, frontline countries, vulnerable countries. So there is a trust component over here that needs to be renewed and strengthened. And the third bit is leadership itself, like really questioning the current leadership in the UNFCCC and the negotiations, and to say, is this the kind of leadership that we need at this moment, in this phase of the climate negotiations, where in each phase of the negotiations, it's very different. When the convention itself was sort of like it came into life, it was very different. It was more on agenda setting and trying to define the problems, and that was a very different kind of leadership. And we need like a more entrepreneurial leadership perhaps right now, or leadership that actually takes us through implementation of things that have been already discussed. So we need to also like start looking at how are we revitalizing leadership, especially in the post-Paris regime that we have. So these are some of the like the context setting for what I and a lot of people that I've consulted with as part of our work at the YNA as well sort of like bring about. And these are things that we really wanted to address then at the YNA as well, at the Youth Negotiators Academy. For us, we did not want these to just stay as they are, and we wanted to move away from the current reality to a more aspired reality. And we wanted to understand how could we then leverage youth leadership or young people to sort of like address all of these long-term effects and the components that I just like addressed. Before I go into more details, current state of young people within UNFCCC negotiations. So before I go into that, it's good to also understand how the COP itself is set up. So the first thing in the sense of actors, so there are two big groups of actors, and one is party stakeholders and the other is non-party stakeholders. Sometimes they're also called state actors and non-state actors. So state actors or party stakeholders are those who are representing their government. So they are usually designated with a badge which has like a pink ribbon. Usually that's for both at SBs as well as COP, it's the same color. So that's when you are representing your country and your citizens and you're mandated to represent. And the other side is non-party stakeholders, also called as observers. So they are the observers to the process. And so that's like the first distinction of groups of categories of participants at these conferences. The second is also how like the physical space itself. More recently, there has been this evolution of a green zone and a blue zone, and colors are increasing lately. I think Brazil's having a yellow zone. I heard, I'm not very sure. I haven't been following all of the news. But so in the blue zone is where the core negotiations happen. So the rooms where the countries, the parties are sitting down, having these discussions in the formats that also Heidi had explained before, like the informals, the contact groups, etc. The plenaries, everything happens in the blue zone, and more adjacent discussions around the negotiations itself, and thematics that can be more integrated, aligned, but not exactly core to the negotiations itself. So those kind of discussions also then happen in the green zone, and mostly then the blue zone is predominantly represented then by party stakeholders. But of course, the observers to the process are also there, they are observing. And in the green zone, then you have the more of non-state actor activities. But then, of course, then the party stakeholders are a part of these discussions, and they are coming in and they are trying to be a part of the discussion, take concepts from inside to outside to inside, and then also bring in the inputs from inside those negotiations to the green zone, so people are more aware of what's going on and how to connect and make those links and bridges. So what we do there, so what you can often recognize when it comes to the roles and responsibilities of young people within the UNFCCC negotiations is they are predominantly non-party stakeholders, or at least that is also how, or like majority of young people you might meet are actually non-party stakeholders. And of course, they engage in both green zone and blue zone. And with the kind of work that we do at the Youth Negotiators Academy, what we really want to do is move away from that and make young people to be a part of party stakeholders. And what that means is be a part of the core negotiation teams and ensure that they are able to bring in the representation of younger generation into the decision making tables and rooms, recognizing that currently it has a very homogeneous nature and tone to it. So you'll see a very specific gender, a very specific age group, hair color inside the negotiation rooms, and who are actually having those mandates to be decision makers from like for their countries and to represent their citizens and people. And which is not kind of fair if you think about it, because the decisions that are being made today is affecting and will be implemented over the course of the next few decades. And that means that those who are going to be impacted by those decisions need to be at the forefront, and they are not there. And not just that, as I said, it's very homogeneous, and there's not enough representation of women or indigenous peoples or gender diverse peoples, and in general representation of those for whom decisions are like actually being made. So yeah, so this is primarily what we sort of like move towards, and I see that I'm slowly getting closer to time, so I will try to get further. Therefore, what we wanted to do is think about how do we bring intergenerational collaboration for environmental justice, for building those trust elements. How do we make sure that we are able to utilize this unique energy and vision and impact that young people can actually bring, put them into the existing system, and make sure that we are able to democratize the participation within. And that is primarily like then how we like do our work itself, which is to like look at parity of participation. And we look at it in two forms. One is the procedural component, and the second is the representation component. So when I talk about procedure, what it really means is that the system itself is structured in a way that there is no pipeline. There's no way for a young person just to say, oh, okay, you can be in the negotiations tomorrow. It just doesn't happen just because you're young, right? However, there is this historic marginalization, which is why then you don't have access to the necessary talent, necessary capacity or necessary educational background, or like the preconditions or the jobs that you've been needing to be getting there. So there's this whole component. So what first we do is look at how do we procedurally enable access. And what we do with our work is work with countries and ministries of environment, or the focal point ministry to UNFCCC from every country directly. And we sign these agreements where we tell them that they will have to bring in young people as a part of the negotiation teams. And the country signs that agreement, because we then say we do free talent management for you. What we mean is that we will ensure that we build that person's capacity, whoever they nominate to us, we will build their capacity, make sure that they're knowledgeable, they're grounded, they're well connected, and they have this community of care that is needed for them to be effectively participating and playing the role of a negotiator. So the representation justice is automatically there, because representation justice also refers to how a person, once they've been brought into the rooms and tables, how are they able to exercise their legitimacy as real leaders. And to exercise that, they need to show that they are capable of holding that position and holding that role, and can bring the knowledge and the skills that is needed. So this is primarily how we then bring in young people into the negotiations itself. And that is just quickly to show then how we do this. We do work both with young negotiators, where there's like a whole lot of training that is done through, just like how this training is designed. But ours is 6 months long, and it's very longitudinal. You do it for 3 years, and you're like constantly a part of your country's delegations. And because we've already secured your space as a part of your country's negotiation teams, there is this longitudinal learning journey that you have. So you learn with us, you learn with your negotiation teams, you represent your country at the COP, and then that really gets you strengthening your position in that role. What we also do is then say, okay, what is the kind of work that we need to then do with a larger system to build that islands of coherence for enabling this kind of reform and governance changes within, because we're changing actors. So that's also another part of our work. Why this has been quite successful in the last 4 years, where we've worked now with 70 countries just for climate program, and we've trained around 300 negotiators just last year, and we've also had at least 150 of them being a part of their country's delegations on the ground at a COP. So the first is holistic design, the recognition of both the procedural component and that capacity component is really important. There are many times initiatives that are building capacity, but they don't really have the bandwidth to place them in their country's negotiation teams. Then you are knowledgeable, but we don't have a mechanism to get you in, or the other way around. There's a mechanism to get you in, but they're not doing a training. And that holistic design really was a big part of how then we visualize this to actually work. The second is, this is a global program recognizing the solidarity building component, because consensus is how the decisions are made at a COP, and which means that you need to have friends, whether you're from a global north country or a global south country, you need to be able to build that solidarity. There are 2 other components, but I will also slowly move away. But just to say that we're really thinking about design in the sense of interconnectedness and looking at intergenerational collaboration really has been also quite effective for us. I made this slide, but I'm also not going to do this because Heidi actually did a really beautiful job with her slide on engaging effectively. It's the same, but in different words. So I will leave it there, and also then say thank you. If you want to reach out, the organizers can later share contact information with you.
Thank you so much, Veena. We're so sorry for the time constraint. You did an amazing presentation. And again, you'll receive a bunch of questions. Okay, so our next amazing speaker is Haley, the Executive Director of Care About Climate, an international organization dedicated to breaking barriers and building pathways for young people to develop skills for confidently engaging and making an impact in climate policy spaces. She's a cross-sector leader with experience leading youth policy initiatives at UNFCCC events, like the COP, designing climate action guidelines for islands and universities, developing zero waste strategies and partnerships, and crafting climate education materials. She's currently working for Honolulu's Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resilience, where she is designing OHA's. I'm so sorry I butchered that. OHA? Haley, please help me. Climate adaptation plan and leading their equity work. Haley, please go ahead. Reminder to drop your questions in the Menti or ask them live, and apologies for butchering the names.
Oh, no, it's so great. Can y'all hear me well, I hope? Okay, great. I'm outside, so hopefully things run smoothly. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. And just to clarify, I used to work for the City and County of Honolulu's Climate Adaptation Office, recently left that role, but still did great work with them. And for anyone wondering, it's pronounced Oahu, of how you pronounce that island. But really great to be here today, and I'm going to keep it pretty quick since I know you've already seen a lot of presentations, and this might be a little bit repetitive, so I apologize in advance. And if it is, someone just let me know in the chat and we'll move on. But here at Care About Climate, we really believe that climate change is an intergenerational challenge, and that means it also requires intergenerational leadership. And you heard a little bit about that from Vina, and I'm sure the others as well. And for us at Care About Climate, that means that 30 years ago, the world came together, right, to create the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to protect future generations. But all of us are literally under the age of 30. So that was in a sense created for us, and they're not adhering to it and following those practices. And so we as young people have the opportunity to shape the decisions that affect our future the most. And by doing so, we can help create solutions that help actually deliver on that promise of protecting the planet for generations to come. But it's really, really difficult to do that. 94% of young people feel unsupported in multilateral forums. 82% have no idea what their government is doing on climate change. So props to y'all, because I bet if you're here, you have somewhat of an idea about what your government is doing. And 18% of national climate commitments to the Paris Agreement, known as NDCs, don't, or only 18% center intergenerational justice. So there's a really big lack of implementation on intergenerational justice, but in general, a lack of empowerment and capacity building for young people to really have ownership over their voice. And why include young people? It's always good to remember that we have a lot to offer as young people. We're skilled at connecting across generations. We're creative at increasing awareness and action on climate change. A lot of times, we're willing to make compromises on our perspectives if it means that someone in a more vulnerable community is able to have a better outcome. And as a Global North person, that's really important because often people that are in positions of power in my government aren't willing to sacrifice parts of our economy or funding towards something to help those that are most vulnerable. And I find that young people share those values. We're also community champions for climate action. We build bridges across cultures and know when we need to yield the floor to others. And of course, we're not always caught up in adulting or the complacency of a system. And I think there's something really special that we bring to the table on being able to break those barriers. So you already kind of heard this, but who engages in the UNFCCC? Party stakeholders, non-party stakeholders like civil society, party stakeholders are like government people, right? The youth negotiators that Venus program, small plane, that Venus program are training our party stakeholders, the Secretariat, and of course the science delivered by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There are a few other groups, but for simplicity, I think that these capture the main ones for all of us, except for, of course, the media and security.
Sorry to interrupt, Taylor. Can you speak a little bit slower?
Oh, slower. So sorry. Yes. Thanks for letting me know.
Thank you.
I will speak much slower. And so for the non-party stakeholders, these are grouped into, a lot of them are grouped into constituencies, and constituencies are engaged in formal climate processes since the beginning of the process of time in the creation of the UNFCCC. Some of them came earlier, like the environmental NGOs, and others are newer, like the youth NGOs or the women and gender NGOs. But essentially, these are loose groups of NGO stands for non-governmental organizations that have diverse but broadly clustered interests and perspectives. So as you can see on the screen, there are 9 of them: businesses, environmental NGOs, farmers, indigenous peoples, local governments, research and independent groups, which typically include the universities, trade unions, women and gender, and children and youth. And these slides will be shared with you so you can refer back to the who they represent and their main focuses at a later time. But the question is, why join a constituency? They have access to plenary sessions. In fact, they can even take the floor to give interventions during negotiations when they are allowed, which is really important because those interventions are the main opportunity for these groups to make their voices heard, but also to propose concrete outcomes, because often parties don't always represent the outcomes of all of the people that are the most vulnerable on their own, because they have to deliver what their government believes. And that's not always shared with what the civil society members believe. So it's really a good opportunity to kind of build a bridge between what people in government can say and what you as civil society think needs to be added on to these discussions. They also can give informal advance on information on upcoming sessions from the Secretariat. There's timely information through their own daily meetings. They can create bilateral meetings with other officials of the convention. And of course, my favorite part, a community to spur collective advocacy efforts and really play the field better to get better outcomes, because you can go and talk to as many parties as you want and befriend them all, and to really help get to the outcomes that you think are needed. So influencing the negotiations, I'm going to go through these quite quickly because we don't have too much time, but some ways to influence negotiations are raising public awareness, engaging with the media through pre-prepared talking points. As I mentioned, hosting bilaterals with government, which you can do by approaching country offices or approaching negotiators after a negotiation session. What I like to call guerrilla advocacy, which means catching the negotiators in the hallways or in the cafes and having your 30-second pitch ready to talk with them. And of course, actions, which are the form of protesting that are formally allowed in the UNFCCC. They are called actions. And yeah, these are some ways to raise your voice. Some rules of interventions. I believe you got some of this today, so I'm going to skip over this section as well. But I really wanted to take the rest of the time to focus in on some wins and advice from my own experience. So if you're ever wondering and going to your government and trying to advocate for youth inclusion, there's actually decision text that they've already adopted that says young people should be engaged in the national, multilateral, and local processes, especially under the Paris Agreement, and that youth are stakeholders in climate decision-making and implementation. So if you're ever struggling to get access to your government, or they're unsure why they should include you, you can always give them the text that they've already agreed to that says, yes, young people are important agents of change on climate action. So definitely keep these in the back pocket. These phrases also led to something we do at Care About Climate called the NDC Equity Tracker, where we've trained young people to analyze countries' national climate plans for gender and intergenerational justice, as well as climate ambition. And you can see this map. Red and purple mean they're not doing great. Yellow and green are great examples. Just on a first look, you can see there's not a lot of yellow and green. Hopefully this round of NDCs are able to change that. But what's really cool about this program is that it empowers people from their country to analyze them and create recommendations that are then associated with your own cultural and local context and perspective as people on the ground, as opposed to other agencies that really focus on these academic or scientific studies. This led to something we're doing right now, which is an opportunity that you can all engage in called the Universal NDC Youth Clause, where we're encouraging governments to actually recommit to those same youth elements I just showed you from the decisions in their new NDCs. And I'll drop some links in the chat later about that. Some highlights of what you can do once you have a campaign or when you're working in this space is you can present it at UN climate change conferences. You can see it be adopted in different reports because you can make submissions. And of course, something really cool is we actually had our tracker informed the Dominican Republic's 2025 NDC consultation. So it's really cool to see what you can do as young people in this space. Now, my last section is an advocacy win. So I'm going to paint you a picture. Imagine that it's been a week of negotiations, you've had 5 hours of sleep or less, and parties are finally about to adopt a decision text that actually includes young people as stakeholders for the first time. It's Friday night, and you start getting calls from negotiators saying the decision might go to Rule 16, which means the decision isn't adopted and it gets moved on to the next agenda at the next conference, and you've worked really hard. Then negotiators start calling, in this scenario, negotiators started calling me to get more information on what others were saying, and I remember being surprised because I was like, I'm just a constituency member, like, what do they want to know from me? They wanted to know, would Youngo block the decision? They wanted to know, what are you hearing from this government and that government on human rights, which was the big issue, that human rights was left out of the decision. This was really tense for us because we had done a lot of advocacy to get the youth inclusion wins in the text. And if we were to go to Rule 16, that means it could all be renegotiated. So we were really in a tough spot. But it was also a cool spot because a lot of the parties were looking to us as civil society. What happened? They ended up passing the decision, and a lot of people made significant regrets for the exclusion of human rights, which were eventually put into the text the following year. And so in this experience, what I learned is that building relationships with negotiators that will champion your ask, but also those that are likely to back them and raise them on the floor is really important. A lot of the parties that were supporting us were taking text examples from us and raising them directly. So we were really helping them by offering the decision text, workshopping it with them, and then they would present it. And that was really special. Of course, you also have to expect that negotiators might say one thing to you and another on the floor. And if that happens, you can always ask them later and say, oh, in our conversation, I thought that, we agreed on this principle of youth inclusion, but on the floor, it seemed like maybe that agreement wasn't there. Can you tell me more about that? What are you thinking? And really try to lean into both those that are your friends and those are not as much your friends when it comes to the policy outcome. Remember that your advocacy is a strategy too. You also don't have to tell all of the negotiators everything that you're thinking about or that's on your plate. You can also engage in that negotiation practice of only telling them what they need to know at that time to really help keep your strategy secured. Of course, always offer gratitude and say hi when you see negotiators walking by, building that relationship with people. One is just a nice thing to do as a person, but two, the more you interact with them and are showing friendliness to them, the more they might want to partner and work with you. And lastly, when you can work with other constituencies to champion shared outcomes, definitely do it. A lot of times it's better to have constituencies working together and say, hey, women and gender constituency, would you be willing to elevate this youth principle? We would be willing to elevate this for you in our submission as well. And getting that collective action together can really help create some good change. That's all I have for you from my presentation. If you want to stay in touch, here is an email and our social media. But yeah, I'm excited to get to the questions.
Thank you so much, Haley. That was amazing and so comprehensive. And thank you to all of our speakers. Okay, so for everybody, we did have another speaker lined up. However, he is stuck in the negotiations. So speaking of the session being about UNFCCC processes and negotiations, sometimes a meeting is set for an hour and it somehow ends up lasting 3 hours. You can see in the chat that our speakers are all noting how they don't sleep in COPs because you just kind of don't have a lot of time sometimes. And because of that, unfortunately, Dr. Richard will not be able to join us. He is fighting the good fight, as they say. And so we are just going to directly move on to the questions. Again, it's going to be half live questions and half Menti. I can now see a lot of really amazing questions dropped into the Menti, which Lucy will take care of. But for now, whoever has questions, please raise your hand and we'll take around likely 5 because of time constraint, maybe 7 if we must, and then jump into the Menti questions. Does that sound good? Great. I can already see 3 hands raised up. I'll start with, oh, and just to note, if you raise your hand and speak, this is all being recorded. It will be posted on YouTube. Just note that your face will be on YouTube, okay? I'll start with the first hand, which is Fadila. Please go ahead and ask your question, direct it at whoever speaker you want to take the lead on answering, but all of our speakers are also welcome to jump in with their perspectives and experience. So go ahead, Fadila, and thank you.
Okay, thank you, Myrna. Actually, I have 2 questions for Fina and for Hailey. First thing first, thank you everyone for the amazing session. For Fina, looking at the current status quo, what do you see as the biggest challenge in ensuring meaningful youth participation, especially for make sure that the participation of youth is meaningful and is not only for the symbolically represented, but it's a meaningful participation, especially from the MAPA or most affected people and areas. How can we amplify their voices? And then for Hailey, I would like to ask from another perspective because I've been following the Care About Climate and I'm really impressed about the Care About Climate. And I would like to ask, I'd love to learn how do you prepare your team member to join the negotiation process at the SBS or at COP, because currently I'm preparing for the local conference of youth in Indonesia, and I would like to hear your insight how to build the readiness and capacity for youth to participate in the high-level climate negotiation process. Thank you.
Perhaps I kick off and Haley, then you continue there. So, Fadila, you asked about meaningful youth participation, and I ask a question back to everybody here. What do we define as meaningful, right? Like, so that this has been very like contested, and like, what does really meaningful mean? And it is very hard to sort of determine that because in different contexts it does change differently. But what we recognize is that it is extremely important for young people to be involved in various different formats. They need to be inside the negotiation rooms as party delegates, and within that, there the meaningful is more from the place of how are the countries using or like that's or ensuring that they are empowering those young people as a part of their negotiation teams. Are they making sure that they're sharing information? Are they making sure that they are actually like including them as a part of these dialogues and pre-preparation and at COPs, instead of just making them go for coffee runs and do secretarial jobs. So that sort of ends up becoming meaningful sometimes. And meaningful also sometimes is about how those who are now representing a whole community of young people or that intersectional groups in the negotiations, how are they meaningfully ensuring that they're connecting with youth groups within their countries, and those who are working in the grassroots levels, like you, Faridla, you're doing the local conference of youth. How are those how are we connecting to those pieces so we're able to bring ultimately voices of young people from outside to inside? Often we get to do that by advocating, lobbying with other negotiators, but if you had an ally inside, then it is also very, very easy to sort of bring them in. Last point I want to also mention is that in that sense, like there are many different organizations thinking about this in many different ways, and sometimes it's also good to question if that is all making sense or if it's a distraction too, because we might actually distract and move away from engagement, and that plurality could be a boon or a bane. So that's a question that we need to be also like always asking if this is at some form feeding into the process itself effectively.
I know there's quite a few people with questions. Maybe should we take a couple and then I can answer then in case I can answer someone's question by also answering your question. If that'd be okay.
Yeah, sure.
I'm so sorry, I froze for a second. Haley, did you answer the second part? What happened?
I was just saying that maybe we should take a couple of questions and then it's possible I'll answer someone's question while answering this one. So maybe we can take a few
Okay.
to make sure we have time for more of them.
Sounds good. Then the second hand is Mateo Morales.
Yeah, for sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So this question is for Haiti. I have two questions. The first one is for Haiti, and the second one is for Vina. The first one is about what do you think, in your personal experience, it's the most important strategy or the strategy that is useful at the moment to represent countries, development countries or countries in development? Because, for example, I live in Ecuador, and sometimes it's kind of complex participate in this in these diplomatic situations, because we don't have like too much territory, even when we have resources and so on. So I am so interested about that. And the second question is about what do you think that's the most important tool in our contemporary days for young people to start participating in role leader in these kind of events, for example, the COPs. And yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mateo. All right, so you guys want to take some questions and then answer them all, right? Okay, sounds good. Then the next question is from Maria Paula.
Yes, thank you. So many thanks for your presentations. They were amazing and really nice to meet you. I do have two different questions. One is more related kind of the role that the different negotiators accomplish at the different COPs. So I wanted to know if it is essential kind of working in the Ministry of Environment or being a young negotiator to be part of that process, or which are the different ways to get at that negotiations parts. And the second question is more related to my work, because I am working mainly with cities and local governments and developing different climate projects. So I wanted to know if it is like the participation from cities or local governments are included in the different negotiations, or it's only in the side events or other spaces for only cities, because I think the lower level point of view are also important at the national level. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we're gonna take this group of questions from Mateo and Maria Paula, answer and Fadila, answer them, and then take another group, and then we'll jump to the mentee. And you guys can just go ahead and answer them as you want, like in whatever order you prefer.
Yeah, I can jump in first. Thank y'all for the questions. I'll keep it short because I know there's a lot of them, but on how do we prepare delegates, that was the question I'm just going to lump into this, is also related to my most important strategy for helping to get your voice heard. And that is really going online to read the submissions of different parties when it comes to negotiations, but also this can work in the national level too. You have to know what people are talking about because if you approach them and you don't have you don't show that you have an understanding of what they're talking about, what they end up doing when they meet you is just they just mansplain to you everything and think that you don't know it. So often I will enter a discussion and I'll say, hey, we'd really love to talk about loss and damage. We know X, Y, and Z about it. We understand that this is your position. Can you tell us a little bit more about this specific component? Or we are really interested in the gender impacts of this component. What would we need to do to move forward on that? So coming in and showing that you know what they're talking about is honestly like the number one thing. So more practically, it can be something like reading what's going on and summarizing it with a few key points. And then when you write what I also like to do is I write my questions for the different government officials, and then I write a follow-up question based on what I think their response might be. If I think the response is going to be positive, I write one set of questions to follow, but I also imagine what if their response is negative, and I write another set of questions if their response is negative. So you have to always be prepared, and when you do that in advance, one, you're a lot more confident because you're like, I have everything I need to say written down, so you don't have to worry about remembering something. But second, it really shows them that you're pretty organized. So I think those are kind of that kind of goes to how do we prepare delegates and how do we help get people's voices heard. I think there was one more question on participation and getting heard by your government can be really hard. I'm from the United States, and our country, especially now, but even before now, was plagued by a huge lack of participation of marginalized voices and continues to be so. And often it really requires being relentless, emailing them. If you have friends that live in the capital city, to try and organize meetings in person with them. But it really requires relying on your friends who live there. For me, I live in Honolulu, Hawaii in the US. That's like the furthest possible you can live almost to our capital city. It's like 12 hours by flight. So it's not not close. So I rely on my friends there, but I also am not afraid to just email them or at a negotiation session, go up to them and say, oh, hey, like you're Marcy. I emailed you to really discuss this thing. I wanted to know if you had some time. You just got to be, and you're young. When you're young, you can just use it as power. They're not going to think that you know the difference as long as you're nice about it. But some of it is strategic. And of course, your government might not always listen to you. And if that's the case, that's when kind of going to the media and trying to expose some of the harsh realities on the ground ends up becoming the best strategy, because if people get nervous when they see things in the media a lot of times. And so it's another really good way to move forward on it. But yeah, I think that sums it up, but feel free to let me know if I didn't answer someone's question. But Heidi or Vina, over to you.
Heidi, do you want to go on anything, because you haven't spoken yet? I'll come after.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking through the Menti and I'm looking at your questions in the Zoom, and these are all amazing questions, everybody. And it's a shame that we haven't got more time to go through them all. I'll take a step backwards before I answer your question, Mateo, because one of a speaker that unfortunately wasn't able to come was going to briefly speak to you about the different negotiating groups that we have. And I think that's relevant in answering your question. So you all may or may not already be aware that the UN as a whole operates according to regional groups. So you have, there are 5 UN regional groups. You have the African states, you have the Asia Pacific states, you have Eastern European states, you have Latin America and Caribbean states, and then you have a group called Western European and other states, which is sort of a catch-all for other developed countries. Then taking a step down from those UN regional groups, you have negotiating groups, and the negotiating groups that we have in the climate regime don't necessarily match up with the negotiation groups that you have across the whole UN system. So you have, for example, the Least Developed Countries Group, which is a UN-wide group that negotiates for the least developed countries. And then you also have the European Union, which is also a formal institution that has very specific membership. And then you also have the G7 and 7 China. There are obviously other examples, but just in the interest of time, those are just a few examples. You also have the ILAC, the Latin American country group, which is another kind of a different type of negotiating group insofar as ILAC operates within the climate negotiations, but not necessarily across the UN. And so it's really a good exercise in terms of preparing for following negotiations and being strategic in the way that Haley and Vina have also very usefully covered, to basically get yourself a list of what all these groupings are and figure out what all the different strategic alliances are. Because essentially the reason a negotiation group is formed is because countries see that they have aligned interests and that it's a useful mechanism for them to advance their interests. So for you, Mateo, and I think you said you were from Ecuador, so I'm sorry if I got that wrong, but hopefully I got that right. So for Ecuador, for example, they're part of the Latin America and Caribbean regional grouping, but in terms of negotiation groups, Ecuador is part of Grupo Sur, and that group has also Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and so that's one group that Ecuador would use to strengthen their position and group with other countries so that they have a stronger way to advance their position by working collectively with those other groups with similar positions. And then the other group that Ecuador is part of is the group of the Coalition of Rainforest Nations, which has actually quite a number of countries, and it's not just Latin American countries. So there's also countries from Africa in that coalition and across the world. And I guess just to demonstrate the complexity, again, we've sort of, I think, maybe conveyed the issue of complexity of the negotiations, is a region like Latin America and the Caribbean has countries in the G7, 7 China, in ILAC, in Grupo Sur, they have LDCs, they have Alliance of Small Island States, they have like-minded developing countries negotiation group, the Coalition for Rainforest Nations, and they also have Mexico, which is in the Environmental Integrity Group. So you could do that exercise with each of the UN regional groupings, and that cross-section is quite interesting to think about how the different priorities are working in the negotiations. And it's also important to remember that these positions are also different across different topics. So for example, in the mitigation room, there might be certain alliances that are more common across groupings. In loss and damage, broad generalization, but it's often easier for all developing countries to have a unified position on climate change impacts than it is to have a unified position on mitigation because of the economic and social realities of mitigation of climate change. And so having for me personally, and I think there's a few different questions that cover this, in terms of representing developing countries, representing their interests and thinking of most effective strategies, getting a sense of this landscape is critical. And I guess a step down from that, there's the country positions, but there's also personal, there's the people inside the rooms. And so you might have, in one room, you might have a very effective negotiator from a particular country leading the negotiations. And that's not necessarily because that country has a strong position. It's because someone from that country has risen to that position through the people they've met, through their experience, through the way that they've managed to create effective diplomatic relationships. And that person will carry through the negotiations. And if you identify those important people in the room, that can also make you a more effective negotiator. And then I think there was another question among the chat that I could also touch on briefly in this answer about coordinating positions. And this is, because of this complexity, coordinating positions is again the key. And Mina also mentioned about consensus building, that because this is a consensus process, building solidarity across groups, as she so well put, is also key. This is not a voting process. This is everybody agrees, and if there's an outliner, all the dominoes can fall down. So I guess in terms of coming back to your question, Mateo, I think for Ecuador, it's working within groups or in the Coalition of Rainforest Nations, and then finding other negotiating groups in other countries that might be able to champion the issues of your particular context. Thanks.
I can come in perhaps again on some of the questions that have already come in, and also to complement what Heidi and Haley have shared already. So the first thing is, Heidi did mention that groups are they're aligned on their interest, and that interest can be different. So as she said, like sometimes it's on a particular economic interest, and sometimes it's because of geography. So all of the African countries are with like a single group. And they can align based on different thematics and the discussions that's going on in the room in the different groups that they are in, and say, okay, for example, Egypt is with the Arab group and the African group. So sometimes they are like sort of negotiating as a part of the Arab group. Sometimes they're negotiating as a part of African group. So there are so many different things, but also another bit I wanted to bring in there is to talk about the importance of the informal groups as well. So there are informal groups. So the formal groups are the ones you can represent as in the formal negotiation rooms. However, over the last few years and decades of climate negotiations, there have also been a lot of other informal groups that have come about. And many times the informal groups have come about to build ambition. For example, the Cartagena dialogue. It is both countries from developed world and the frontline countries, and really trying to see how do we build that solidarity and those informal conversations and discussions. And so that is generally done at a heads of delegation level. These discussions happen. There's the High Ambition Coalition, which is more at the ministerial level. It also has, it is led by, or the leadership has been with the Marshall Islands. So they're a small island country, but then there are more than 100 countries as a part of the High Ambition Coalition. So these have been really key in also like pushing for the Paris Agreement and the language behind, etc. So anyway, I wanted to share that as a compliment. And countries can also start a new group at any point they want. There's nothing that stops them. So today, if a certain set of countries come and say, I have ambition. These are the 5 countries that are bringing similar ambition. We want to create a new group. They actually can, and you can be a part of multiple groups too. So it's really fascinating once you understand how to really like then utilize the system that you're working with to enhance processes within. Having said that, I will move on and go to the negotiators and young people that a lot of questions came about. And also, I think there was one on how are they selected that was asked just a bit ago. So I wanted to quickly come in to share that what we do is we reach out to the Ministry of Environment or Foreign Affairs or whoever is the focal point ministry to the UNFCCC, and there's a list that is publicly available. If you just type UNFCCC focal points on your search engine, and you'll find that list easily. So we have the connections to them, we reach out to them, and we request them to nominate 4 young people to us, and we give them specific guidelines. And the guidelines do not ask about, oh, what is your education level? Anything is fine, but primarily what we need is them to nominate women and men. We ask them to nominate young people from civil society as well as from the government, maybe junior staff, who will probably not be brought into negotiations for a very long time as like a decision maker with mandates that have been provided for them to be a negotiator for their country, etc. So really that is how we bring in that inclusion part. And what we do is when the countries don't know, or they say, I don't know who are these young people in my country. It happens many times. So what we do is then we connect those countries with specific youth groups that we are aware of in these countries, or any specific individuals, and say, oh, these are some of these groups that we know in your country. Why don't you talk and try and see who could best be a part of your country's delegations? Reason why country nominates them to us is because there needs to be a certain level of trust amongst those who are representing the country, the citizens, as a part of their negotiation teams. So the country needs to trust this person that we're training. Otherwise, that could be a reason why they say, oh, you trained them, but we don't trust them. I'm sorry, we can't take them as a part of it. So we really don't want countries to give us any excuse for not engaging that person once their capacity has been built through the program we run.
Thank you so much, Vina, and thank you so much, everybody. Haley, I understand you have to go back, right? So thank you so much for joining us. Heidi and Vina, would you be able to stay for another 2 questions, or do you also have a hard stop? It's completely understandable if you do. All right. Then Haley, thank you so much. You can stay for 2 final questions or go ahead back to work. We completely understand how busy you are, and thank you so much for joining us now. But first we'll take 2 final live questions from Sventala, and so Sventala can go first, and then we'll take Mohammed's question and answer those.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for the insights that you have shared. I'll keep the question short, and it is, how do you navigate the trade-offs in negotiating climate policies where you need to balance, for example, biodiversity with the needs of people, of current generations, of future generations? And yes, I would love to hear from anyone who wants to take that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Svetlana. And I'm so sorry for butchering your name the first time, possibly now. Mohammed, could you go ahead with your question as well? Mohammed Heidi.
Hi, thanks for this amazing session, and I get many informations. So I have some questions for you. So the first one is the developing countries have the same degree of right in participation in climate negotiations like the developed country. Also, the next question. The next question, when some countries makes a veto right in the COP simulation to express that they refuse this decision, so they must they express why or no? because in the previous COPs simulation, I observed the way when they make veto, they express but in the previous COP 29, I see that Nigeria and India, when make veto well, when they refuse the climate funding decision, they don't express why.
Should we
I-
go or?
Yeah, I think Mohammed is frozen, but I think you guys can go ahead and take both questions if you can. Thank you so much.
Heidi, would you like to start or do you want me to?
Either or, I don't mind. Do you want to respond to Svetlana
Sure.
and I can try Mohammed's question?
Sounds great. So the first one was the trade-offs. That's a hard one actually, because that's what the most seasoned people within the space are also trying to figure out. And the trade-offs have different and each of the cases are very different, right? Sometimes it has an economic challenge, it has a political one, it has a more representational one, and each country is very different. So it's quite hard. But I think the most important thing when it comes to trade-offs and in general playing this role as a negotiator is actually having an understanding of what's a want, what's a need, what are your red lines, what you cannot really accept at all. So that's like the first thing. And differentiating and putting your needs and the situation of your country in a bucket, in these buckets, is such an important thing. The second is really understanding also the interests and mandates of your counterpart. What are they coming with? What are their interests and mandates? And how do you then like sort of recognize everything? So these are like really key things that I would say. But also, how are you aware before? I mean, because when you are in one negotiation room, in another negotiation room, there's a deal that's happening about these topics and you have no clue about, right? Because you're not inside. And this happens like many times too. So then it takes a lot of coordination and understanding best with your country and then your group, like, really effectively. And often we don't get to do that too. So that's why disappointment at the end of a COP as well. And maybe sometimes you're coordinating on this and then you recognize that you've not had the time to actually show up at the plenary, like how we've had COP28 happen, where the small island states were actually not there because they were talking about these things, and the trade-off was that they were not even there. So what I want to say is this is definitely something very, very complex, but what helps is really understanding your position and like categorizing them, understanding your counterparts' positions, categorizing them, mapping out what are the different things that are happening at the same time, and how do you then build what's necessary as a part, like as position as a part of your country. And then so there is like a series of things that you can do to make the best deals that you would like to. That's probably what I would add. And maybe the next, just to say, all countries, it's a consensus-based process. There's no veto in this process. Every country needs to buy in. So the objection is the thing. So if you don't agree, it's fine, but you can't, if you object, that's when there is no processing of a decision. But I'm also going to leave Heidi to get the technical bits here.
Thanks, Vina. And I, in my attempt to quickly to get through multiple questions, I think I was sort of reflecting as you were speaking that I think that both of the questions kind of Mohammed and Svetlana both come down to similar, have a similar foundation in terms of the power, where the power is in terms of the sessions. I think in terms of navigating trade-offs and balancing red lines, wants, needs, in terms of the right for participation and how decisions go down in the end. And I kind of touched on this in my presentation, I guess, in terms of the way that law operates in kind of the private sphere. And then there's the way that things operate in multilateral negotiations. And there's definitely a frustration as as someone with a legal background, that just because the process or the rule says one thing doesn't mean that's how it will play out in practice. And it was useful also, Vina, when you spoke to the sort of the other higher level groupings. So you have, I mean, we haven't had time to go into this, but you have COP presidencies as well that also have a really big impact on the process. And we saw that in Baku with the way that the decision making happened in the plenary session. And then there was also the example that you just provided of what that looked like in Dubai. And it was different in Egypt and it was different in Glasgow, and every COP presidency has their way of operating in terms of how the final decision texts go down. And so sometimes, even though as a fact this is a consensus-based system and the right to participation is the same across all groups, and there's the convention says that we have to take into account the current and future generations. That's not necessarily how decisions are made, and often the decisions that are made are this strange kind of mishmash of interests and the lowest common denominator in terms of outcome. And the important part then, and there was a question again somewhere in the stream of questions about how, I think it was about how something could come from, an idea from seeding to actually being adopted in a decision. And this can be a multi-year, many different sessions process to get to a certain outcome that is, is considered most beneficial. And even then, so I think the loss and damage fund, the fund for responding to loss and damage, is a good example of that, because I mean, I'm trying to think how to give like a really short history, but I mean, countries wanted loss and damage in the convention when it was first adopted, and then it took until 2013 to get policy body, and we only got the Warsaw International Mechanism and its executive committee because there was a 3-year work program that was talking about loss and damage. And then that moved to having in 2019 we got the Santiago Network, which was another body, and then we went from 2019 to having a committee process, the transitional committee that was set up in the Egypt COP, and they agreed to the idea that there would be a fund, but they didn't agree to any details about what this fund would do. And then in Dubai, we finally got an agreement to get money in the fund, and there was $800 million pledged. And now we've had board meetings for, I don't know, we're coming up on the 2nd year of board meetings, and we have a board and a secretariat for this fund. But we've only received a quarter of the money that was pledged for the fund, and countries still have to agree how that funding is going to be dispersed and the policies for implementation. And then countries will still have to develop funding requests and apply for funding and figure out what they need and what they want. And then there'll have to still be pushes from observers and civil society to ensure that when that money is spent, it includes communities and there's participation and consultation about how that money is spent, ensuring that the most pressing loss and damage needs are addressed. And so it's super quick overview, but that's just an example to say that how long it can take for real impact to happen as a result of these decisions. And so the best you can do in the actual COPs and in the SB session is get we always say the hooks you need in the text, and then the fight continues. It's never a once off or one moment in time process. It's trying to plant the seeds to continue your advocacy and continue the work and continue the fight. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Heidi.
Thank you so much, Heidi. So like for the time, I think
we're out of time.
we're not gonna take 20 questions, but we're gonna like create a document with all of the questions, and then I'm gonna send it to Heidi and Vina and Haley, and if they have the time, hopefully they will. If not, that's completely fine. Maybe they could just like give some brief answers and stuff. But thank you guys so much for joining today. And we hope you guys enjoyed the first like interactive session. And if you guys have any feedback, please let us know. And yeah, there's gonna be like different recordings that you guys will find on the Smith School's YouTube channel after about 24 hours maybe, or a bit longer. And they're also going to be sent to you via email once they're available on the YouTube channel. And well, I don't think we're going to have the different languages for these sessions, but the slides are available for participants in the Google Drive folder, and you guys are going to receive the attendance form in the follow-up email. So thank you guys so much for joining. Thank you to our amazing speakers. Thank you, Heidi, because you're still on this call.
Thank you.
And yeah, thank you so, so much. And we look forward to see you guys for the next session, which is Corporations and Climate Action, where we're going to have Tracy Rambert, Karim Iheb, and Alexis. And hopefully that's also going to be an amazing session. So thank you guys so, so much.
And apologies for taking longer than usual and not having breakout rooms for today, but we hope the session was fulfilling and interactive. And remember, I will send you further details about the assignment over on email. Thank you again, Heidi, so much for your amazing intervention and answering so many questions. And thank you so much for asking all the questions, everybody. Apologies, we couldn't get to all of them. Have a good break. If you're at Bonn, send us a message and maybe we'll meet up, and see you in July. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Luigi. Thank you, Myrna.
Bye, everyone.
Amazing
Take
job,
care.
Thank
guys.
you all.